that day I live in a dream. I live in a dream.
So welcome to Only Trying to Help, the podcast where we try to help you be helpful to other people. My name is Kate Watson, and I've brought back Ro. We had such a great chat when Ro was with us before. Honest to God, don't remember what season that was, Ro. I want to guess maybe season 6 or 7.
I think it was season 6.
Okay, season 6. So glad that you're back so that we can continue this conversation. I do think of you as one of my gurus around the topic of substance use, substance misuse. And so I just want to thank you for coming back on to talk about it.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the warm welcome, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to a wider audience about these things. I don't know about guru, but it is something that I feel is always worth a conversation. And one of the things I feel strongly about is by talking about these things, we reduce stigma, and by reducing stigma, we improve the quality of people's lives.
Couldn't agree more. I think even brief conversations like the one we're about to have just help continue a larger conversation that we ought to be having.
Yeah, they really are. They can be kind of like drops in a bucket in a way, in the sense that like they do add up, and even like brief conversations serve to normalize things that may be difficult to talk about. Just hearing them, getting that exposure that like, oh, okay, it's okay to talk about this.
Yeah. And when you were here with me in the past, you were sharing about your work around drink refusal, which honestly, I told you then, it was like a concept I was sort of introduced to by you that I hadn't thought much about, that there would be even like a science to it, right? Like a skill to practice around refusing drinks when somebody is maybe trying to maintain sobriety. And we were thinking maybe tonight we could talk about sobriety more generally. Before I guide us in some particular direction, was there anything in particular you wanted to share with us about sobriety more generally?
Only the reminder that I think that sobriety and substance use and misuse affect literally everybody. Even if you are not a person who is or has ever, tried to change the amount of that you're drinking or that you're using, you likely know somebody or love somebody that has. And so this is another reason why I feel kind of that destigmatizing these sorts of things is important, because you never know who you're talking to. And so, whenever we perpetuate shame and misinformation about things that people are legitimately struggling with, you never know whose ears are hearing that. And so it could be somebody who's watching a loved one just, go down a pretty painful path. And by kind of being, I don't know, being kind of like a person that sort of like shares the good, I think it can be a powerful intervention in and of itself. Yep.
Yeah, I was nodding when you said you never know whose ears are hearing that. And there's always the possibility that there's someone in your life who is struggling, who hasn't told you yet. And if they hear you speaking negatively about folks who struggle with drugs or alcohol, well, they might just be tucking that idea in the back of their mind. Like, well, don't tell Aunt Barb, because Aunt Barb just said that negative thing. So I guess I can't share my story with Aunt Barb or whatever.
Because when I was having lunch with Aunt Barb, she saw an unhoused person and called them a drunk. And, and she didn't mean any harm, but it harmed me.
Yeah. So that's a great point to think about. You don't know who's listening and how they might take it, and how important it might be for that person to think of you as a safe and comfortable person. And so if you're out there thinking, no, I truly don't know anyone who has any problems with substance use, perhaps they just haven't told you, because perhaps you have shared comments over the years,
Mhm.
and maybe you've painted yourself as someone who isn't safe to talk to.
Mhm. Maybe so, yeah. I mean, and I also believe, like, I hold these two truths kind of simultaneously, which is that, like, um, yeah, it is important to reduce stigma and sort of be that kind of safe space if possible. And also people have a right to a private life. And so, like, sometimes people make their own choices about, what they're going to share. And I support that too. But, there's nothing like having that voice in the back of someone's head saying, like, remember that really, really shitty thing that this person said? Like, do you really want to go there?
Mm. Yeah, it's hard enough to
Mhm.
face these challenges, let alone having to share them with someone who you worry will not be supportive.
Right, right.
Hmm. And we were also thinking, you and I, before we hit record, that the challenges that people face when they're struggling with drugs and alcohol, those challenges may shift. What feels like a challenge one day may not feel like so much of a challenge the next day, but a new challenge
Mhm.
arises. And so the mountains that people climb may be different mountains from time to time,
Mhm.
depending on their life circumstances, depending on the time of year, depending on a lot of things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I beautifully put that I think that the mountains that people climb may be different, but they're still mountains, you know, and the topography may differ, but and maybe some are more difficult than others, but it's still a challenge no matter what.
Yeah, and I don't know how to begin to help people prepare for those challenges. Maybe
Mhm.
there is at times just no way to prepare oneself for the mountains ahead.
Right.
But I also wonder if there are some ways to prepare folks, like,
Mhm.
you know, the holidays are coming up, or so and so's birthday, or your
Mhm.
cousin's getting married. Like maybe there are times where we can begin to predict the
Mhm.
possibility of one of those mountains popping up.
Oh, absolutely. I 100% think that's true. I mean, like trauma anniversaries for one are very much a thing. And when I was still at the VA, in the residential treatment unit, trauma anniversaries tended to be a really risky time for relapse for the veterans, just in terms of, like, the things that they were experiencing, the things that, like, they they were vulnerable, they were vulnerable to at that time, just. And so obviously, like, trauma anniversaries can happen any time of year because, like, they're all different. The holidays can be incredibly triggering for people. um Even really, like, you know winter, or summer for that reason. Like, before you turned on the recording, we were talking about how, um the dark and cold months might present different challenges than, for example, the summer months.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know. I don't know what to say to the helpers. Like I want to
Mhm.
remember that that's the audience here. The folks who are tuning in to listen are very likely wondering, my
Mhm.
brother stopped drinking last year.
Mhm.
He's doing an okay job, but I want to make sure I'm there for him. What are the things I need to be thinking about, um, to be a good sibling to my brother who's
Mhm.
now trying to live a sober life?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think even thinking about it, even just sort of having the, like, you know, sort of the recognition that maybe there are differing needs. Like, if people are wondering, like, how can I be of help to you in this time? Um, I think it's sometimes worth it to ask the nosy question and to ask the uncomfortable question of, like, I really I want you to look back at this time and remember being treated with care and being held with love. What's the best way for me to do that?
I just really love the way that you worded that, because right before you said it that way, I was going to ask a question that I feel like you just answered, but let me hit rewind before you were brilliant.
Mhm.
Um, hitting rewind, I I was going to say, sometimes we want to just ask people, how can I be there for you? How can I support
Mhm.
you? And other times, maybe people just want to be left alone and they don't want us to be nosy, and they want to just be treated like everybody else. And, so how do we know if somebody wants to have this talk or they don't want to have this talk? And so I was sitting over here thinking, I want to ask you that. And then I feel like you kind of answered it when you said that you might turn to your loved one and say, I just want you to look back on this time and see it as the time that you were cared for and held with love. So how do I do that? Do I do that by bringing this up and asking you questions? Or do I bring it up by just leaving you alone and pretending like this isn't happening and just everybody goes on business as usual? But I think if you come at it with the perspective of, I just really want you to look back at this time and say, people were there for me. I think that works.
Yeah, I think so too. And, one thing that I find perhaps not so coincidental is I think that they kind of put it there. And what is the right thing to do? Do I return to it? Do I ignore it? Like, do I, and so a strategy that I think can sometimes be helpful is like actually asking or following up with people in times when you don't have to look at them. So like one time, like I had a friend that mentioned something that was, pretty distressing to them and deeply personal. And then we had to we both had to kind of go our separate ways. Cause I think I had a client perhaps, and she had an appointment or something like that. And I wasn't sure, do I just never bring it up again? Like, was that like a sort of follow her lead? And so I ultimately decided, I think it is a good idea. And kind of out of the blue, I was just like, just so you know, I haven't forgotten what you said. And if you just said it to say it and to kind of put it out there, but have no desire or need to kind of return to it, cool. I just didn't want you to think I forgot. I didn't want you to think I didn't think it was a big deal. We can return to it or not as you feel, would be helpful for you.
Yeah. And Ro, you're giving that as an example of how you were driving. So you were sort of staring ahead.
Yep. I was looking at the road instead of looking intently at her, and trying to make her because I feel like it kind of makes things a little bit less intense, than hey, I want to talk to you about that, painful thing that you mentioned. Hey, I want to talk to you about your sobriety, or because I could also see a couple friends, maybe on their way out to dinner and somebody just saying hey, you haven't really said anything specific about this, but if you ever want to talk about this, we can. And if you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to. And, I'm open to the conversation, however it might look for you. Right.
Yeah. And I think what you're offering us is something that could work in so many scenarios, even if it's not about alcohol use or, it could be any old time that you are trying to have that check-in with somebody, or at least offer the check-in. And so I think that's super applicable. Thank you for that. What else, as we're maybe starting to wind down a little bit here, what else do you think might be a perhaps parting thought on this topic as we think about folks trying to help other folks who are going through whether it is sobriety is a new journey, or one that somebody's revisiting for the second or third time, or they're trying to maintain. We're helping somebody through sobriety has many varieties.
I cannot overstate how helpful I think it is to have sober alternatives, and especially sober alternatives not in a way that's just hey, look at the sober person over here, most of these days, the restaurants that I tend to go to are kind of smaller, kind of mom and pop joints, and they usually don't have a liquor license because there's, I don't know, it varies so much state to state, but here in New Mexico where I'm located, they are many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more. And so, and I usually go to them because they're quieter and there's just less shenanigans happening. I worry less about my safety. I worry less about the safety of the staff when, there's not going to be fights breaking out. So, places like that tend to be like more low key. I mean, I think I would hope that somebody that was like, kind of invested in being a helper wouldn't say like, hey, I want to go to this Oktoberfest thing that's downtown. Like, I know that they have an NA option. Like, I mean, that would be insensitive, right? So I mean, like doing it in a way that is maybe like non-stigmatizing. Like, I think you and I talked about tacos last time. I will talk about tacos like literally anytime somebody asks me about tacos. And so like, hey, I was thinking about going to go to my favorite taco place. Like, do you want to come with?
Yeah, and well, my mind went 20 different directions, but one thing I'll throw out there is there are lots of good reasons to have non-alcoholic options at your party, and it doesn't always have to be because somebody might not partake. It might be somebody is just on a health kick, and it turns out, Ro, alcohol is bad for you.
Turns out, yeah.
I'm not sure if you've heard that news, but
I had my suspicions.
But somebody else could just be the designated driver or just not feeling it tonight. And
just
so
not feeling it.
Yeah. So I think it's important for folks to consider that even if you think of your group of friends as like, oh no, we're all drinkers. Yeah, you may all be drinkers. That's okay. And you probably still want to have some options for when somebody says, hey, I'm driving soon, I better cut myself off.
Exactly. Yeah. And, and also presenting it in a way that's not like, this is the obviously worst option, like, so here's all the craft beer, like, here's the pitcher of margaritas, and here's the LaCroix if you're going to be lame, like, or something like that, or like, here's the Coca-Cola if you want to be a child, like those kinds of like, shitty judgmental comments that, people unfortunately do make, but I mean, again, I like, if somebody is interested in helping, presumably they probably wouldn't be approaching it like that. But then sometimes, like, if people have that kind of like familiar like banter, giving each other a hard time, like, they might not have considered like, maybe that hits a little different now, like, now that there's some context that maybe wasn't there before.
Yeah. I can appreciate somebody thinks they're helping by making a joke, but we've also done a whole episode on well-meaning humor when like you think your joke is lightening the mood, but it really isn't. It's making it awkward.
Yeah. Or it can be just like straight up hurtful. Like, it's just like, it just serves to like other people anymore. Like, especially people like newly in sobriety, maybe it's like, maybe they haven't seen many people, and then like, they're worried about how it's going to go. And then someone makes some comment that like, just like makes them feel isolated and makes them feel like, yep, it's always going to be like this all over again.
The other thing you made me think of when you mentioned the smaller venues where you like to go have dinner, you said they happen to be more low key. They're calmer, quieter. And you made me think, if I'm going to invite my friend out who I know is working towards sobriety, I don't have to call them up and say, hey, I want you to come with me to this restaurant. They don't have alcohol. What I can say is, I'd love for you to come with me to this restaurant. I love it because it's low key. I love it because it's quiet. It's my favorite spot because we can talk and not have to scream at each other. And so there can be other reasons that you're going to that place, and maybe name those reasons so that the person doesn't feel like, I picked this because of you.
Cost. I mean, like, because of, again, like, I can only speak to New Mexico, but like, because liquor licenses are so expensive, the cost of those licenses are often kind of rolled over into just overall like the food and everything like that. So like, tacos at my usual taco joint are like $2 a piece. But if you go to like one of those places, it's got like, the huge like full bar and the margarita machine, then like they're usually like 3 or 4 each or so, and they're not as good. So because they're focusing on the bar. So, but yeah, like just saying like, hey, I found this like little hole in the wall, and it's it's really inexpensive but super delicious, and it's also really quiet. Like, any interest in checking it out? Or even things like, like breakfast joints. I mean, some of them certainly will have like, pitchers and mimosas, but like, it's not really the focus the way it is at like some other places, right?
Yeah. Well, I think this was a helpful way to revisit some of these topics and to do it through a new lens. And I mentioned to you earlier, this is good timing because this particular season, we have another episode looking at substance use, misuse more broadly. And so I think it's always nice to circle back to these things because you're right. One of the first things you said was this is relevant to everybody.
Yep, it really is. And that was one of the reasons why this is even why I studied this in graduate school, why, because when you look at certainly like social determinants of health are obviously a real thing. But when you look at things like, substance misuse and alcohol misuse, it is something that you see in literally every group. You see it in all socioeconomic levels. You see it in all age groups. You see it in all genders. You see it. You see it in people with relatively few risk factors. You see it in people with tons of risk factors. It is truly something that affects all levels of society. And if you think it hasn't affected you, it has. Either through drunk driving and making the streets less safe, or the fact that now that there's metal detectors in every library, or you have to ask for codes for the bathrooms, etc. Those are all a function of people of having to implement safety measures. Like that's what happens whenever people are not getting the services that they need.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we revisited it, and we will again. And so thank you for helping me have that conversation. And so to the audience, I want to say, if you have questions, comments, things you'd like to share, you're welcome to email the show. You can email them to kate@onlytryingtohelp.com. If there's anything that is specifically a question for Ro, I can pass it along to you, Ro. And thanks again for coming on, and we'll do it again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I truly enjoy doing this, and I truly enjoy talking about this.
Take me in your arms. I don't want to miss a day without you. Let's stay young forever. There is nothing we can't do. And nothing can break us apart when we're together. Facing the sky, we know that we can fly on the wings of love. And we can climb on every mountain top. I never knew eternity till I met you. Since that day